I will share my presentation.
Yes, hi everyone. So welcome to the webinar from the Eastern Mediterranean chapter of the International Society of Environmental Epidemiology, a webinar that we have been organizing now for some time with topics that are relevant to the region. Today we have a very important topic that has been in discussion since the WHO air quality guidelines were submitted or were established last year and implemented. And we have the pleasure today to have with us Dr. Francisco Forster, who is currently a visiting professor in Imperial College. And Professor Forster is a well-known figure in air pollution in Europe, as well as internationally. And he organized the International Society of Environmental Epidemiology annual conference in Rome, which I attended, and was a very successful event. Today we will have him talk about the guidelines, and then it will be followed by our next speaker, whom I will introduce, Mr. Mazen Malkawi from the Center for Environmental Health Action with the WHO, to present a perspective also for the region in terms of guidelines. And then we will have questions and answers, a discussion panel afterwards. Anybody who has a question can also submit it via the chat, and we will address them when the time comes. So, Francisco, please go ahead. The floor is yours.
Okay, well, many thanks for this invitation, and I'm very pleased to speak with my colleagues. And as I was mentioning before, I will present in the WHO quality guidelines not only the final results, but also the process, and give some insight on what is there and why we arrived to those deliberations. And as it has been mentioned, I have been a member of the guideline development group of the WHO air quality guidelines. But it's very important I make this disclaimer. I'm speaking now not on behalf of WHO. I'm speaking on behalf of myself only. So anything I say is not WHO. It's only me speaking. So this is very important because I don't want to have consequences of what I'm saying. And I will provide some insight also on the internal discussion and what the main issues were in this process. First of all, as a starting point, I was a member of the committee at that time for the air quality guidelines in 2005. And already there, that was an intense and very laborious process that arrived to the values that you see in this table, especially for the PM 2.5. The 1 year guideline value for PM 2.5 was 10 micrograms cubic meter, and for NO2 was 40 micrograms cubic meter. Very important values, and these values have been quoted for a while during this period. It's important to say, contrary to what we have done for the 2021, the old guidelines were based on narrative review and basically expert opinion, and included not only epidemiology but also toxicology and human chamber studies, and included not only mortality and many morbidity endpoints, although no clear protocols for review and how the guidelines had to be developed. So this is a sort of reflection of limitation of the air quality guidelines in 2005. And this is important to understand the process for the new guidelines. And of course, what's new since 2005, many studies at beginning only on the short-term effects, but then more and more on the long-term effects of air pollutants. And I think the best summary for the effect for the three main pollutants, PM2.5, NO2, and ozone, is this slide that I took from Jason Sachs from EPA, that provide the summary of the evidence for different pollutants and different endpoint with causal and likely to be causal determination. This is very common. You see for PM2.5 and mortality and cardiovascular effect for both the long term and the short term, and likely to be causal for the long term for respiratory effect, lung cancer, and nervous system. Is less for NO2, only with limited, with likely to be causal for NO2, long-term effects, respiratory effects, and causal for short-term. And you see the new deliberation for ozone here. Lots of different studies and new evidence coming that there was a need to update those guidelines. So the process comes from the past, and what the idea was that probably the new levels would be substantially lower for PM2.5 and NO2 because of the new studies, but we need a comprehensive assessment of the evidence. We need to make robust public health recommendation, support decision, and this guideline should be worldwide use. You remember in the 2005 guidelines were done from the WHO office in Bonn. For some period of time, they were thought to be used only for Europe, but as a matter of fact, the 2005 were worldwide air quality guidelines, and but this misunderstanding makes that difficult to be implemented. And these new guidelines were by design intended for worldwide use. Okay. Now, what the methods applied in this process. So first of all, we said we are not going to assess the causality because the causality has been already assessed by international bodies like EPA. We took also Health Canada as an international body, and also the assessment made by COMEAP in UK. So these three different bodies already provide evidence of causality for specific pollutant health outcome pairs. We decided to have a formulation of questions for systematic reviews, and these were the famous PICO questions. And then we decided to have systematic review of the evidence, including assessment of bias and meta-analysis. I will speak about this. The decision was to have an assessment of the level of confidence in the body of evidence resulting from systematic reviews. And then the crucial point was the identification of the air quality levels based on the lowest level of exposure for which there was no evidence of adverse health effects. So these were the methods applied, and the timeline is, of course, is a long process, started in 2015 and ended in September 2021 with the publication of the new guidelines. It's very important that in 2020 we published the results of the systematic reviews in a scientific journal, Environmental International, and I will list them. Let's also say that the main step, having a systematic review, grading the evidence, and formulating recommendations, were done from the two groups of the systematic review teams, which was an external review group, and the guideline development group that was the group I was member of. Here is the list of the systematic reviews. The first 4 systematic reviews are related to mortality, long-term exposure, and mortality from PM, long-term exposure to NO2 and ozone, and mortality, and then 2 papers on short-term exposure to PM, NO2, and ozone, and short-term exposure to SO2, and then 2 systematic reviews, not on mortality, but on emergency room visit in hospital admission due to asthma, and shorter-term exposure to carbon monoxide and myocardial infarction. And you may find these systematic reviews all published as a single papers in the 2020 issue of Environmental International. This is an example of the forest plot coming from the systematic review. This example is for NO2 and non-accidental mortality. This is the results of the systematic review and the meta-analysis. And you see the forest plot comes from with all the results of the single studies in the forest plot, the relative risk for 10 micrograms cubic meter in this specific case, the weight of each study, and it's important to say no specific study had an influential weight in this systematic review. And then we have the effect estimate, the random effect estimate, in this case is 102, so 2% increase in mortality for 10 micrograms cubic meter NO2. And this comes with confidence intervals. The I-square, you see very, very high I-square. It's a sort of indication of heterogeneity. And then the prediction interval, which is also a very useful tool for assessing heterogeneity. What was the new challenge for the air quality guidelines came from the statement in the WHO handbook guideline development, which prescribed the use of grade to make the recommendation. And this has not been an easy effort. And the main reason for this is that grade was developed not for environmental health, of course, but was developed for clinical medicine. And the transference from clinical medicine to environmental health is quite difficult. So this is grade. Grade is quite famous instrument that was well accepted from the Cochrane collaboration. And there's one paper that illustrates the process of grade. I'm not going into details here, but you see this paper. This paper illustrates how you establish an initial level of confidence, and you see this initial level is low for observational studies. So in a way, observational studies are penalized. And then you have a system that the evidence can be downgraded and upgraded according to some specific domains. I will not go through this, but I have to say this is an important. There are differences in environmental health and clinical medicines. They are very important to appreciate. And the main difference are the following. You know, this is very clear. It's maybe too simplistic, but it has been a real challenge for us as epidemiologists. And Mazen was there in the group, and he knows very well what was the discussion were. So clinical medicine has the interest of positive effects, typically the drugs or the clinical intervention. Whereas for environmental health, we want to assess the other, the negative effects. So there are 2 points of view completely different. Clinical medicine is worried about false positive results. You don't want to give a drug which is not effective. Whereas in environmental health, we are very worried about false negative results. We don't want to declare a specific exposure to be innocent when in fact it is risky. So again, two different perspectives. In clinical medicine, the exposure is well defined as the drug. Environmental health, the exposure is estimate. For clinical medicine, you base your evidence on human studies. When environmental health, you base your evidence from integration from human, animal, in vitro studies, and also results in susceptible groups. But there's one important difference, most important difference. When you start a randomized controlled trial, you already have the biological plausibility, because otherwise no one will start a randomized controlled trial. So biological plausibility is a prerequisite for a randomized controlled trial. In environmental health, as you know, you build your biological plausibility in the evaluation. So it's not in an integration of all form of evidence. So the biological plausibility does not come before, but is built within the evaluation process. And there is one important difference, from clinical medicine and environmental health. In environmental health, we don't have randomized controlled trials. The maximum level of confidence that we have is from cohort studies. So it's a different situation, and that it has been very difficult to apply grade to environmental health. So let's go back to the air quality guidelines, and the main aim was to transfer from evidence to recommendations, and deciding about which pollutant concentration you do have adverse health effects. And this evidence recommendation were done with different approach for long-term and short-term values. Basically, the approach was for long-term air quality guidelines to take the mean of the lowest 5th percentile of the studies that were considered in the systematic review. Whereas for the short term, take the 99th percentile of the distribution for a mean concentration that was matching the long-term air quality guidelines. I have the application here. Don't be worried about this summary. Very briefly, to arrive to the air quality guidelines, we followed various steps. And the steps were, of course, to take the relative risk estimated and estimate the concentration response function, to check the lowest level of exposure measured in the single studies, check the minimum relevant increase in health outcome, starting point for the air quality determination, compare the air quality across different levels of outcomes, assess the certainty of the evidence, check the new evidence that has been accumulated after the systematic review, and possibly reconsider causality. These are very complex steps. I will go only through some of them. And of course, I start with the most controversial one, which was NO2. For NO2, I already show you the systematic review. And there are some studies starting at very low level of NO2. This is an example. This is the Canadian census cohort. You see the Canadian census cohort has the exposure response function, the start from values close to 0. This is NO2 in ppb. And we have additional other studies. So what we did, and this is an essential part of the determination of the air quality guidelines, just rank the studies according to the 5th percentiles. You see the median here, of the various studies for NO2 and the fifth percentiles. And ranking these studies, the decision was to take the 5 studies with the lowest fifth percentiles. But as soon as we went to NO2, we realized that for some of them, the estimated fifth percentile was not reliable because was not actually reported, but was dependent on the very high standard deviation. So we excluded these 2 with very low fifth percentiles. We exclude 1 study because it had very high determination for risk of bias. So you see the next 5 studies and the fifth percentile is as a mean of 8.8 micrograms cubic meter. So, when people saw the air quality guidelines for NO2, they just saw, oh, these values 10 does not exist in reality. But actually, we have evidence that this value has been found with lower than 10 in at least 5 studies that have been published and have been considered in the scientific literature. So this is basically the way we assess the 10 micrograms cubic meter for NO2. And of course, we compare with various outcomes, not only all accidental mortality, but also respiratory mortality, COPD, and acute respiratory effects. And you see there is an increased risk, so there is a consistency in the finding. We assess the certainty of the evidence according to grade that was high. We check the new evidence coming from new studies published until summer 2020 that confirmed the results. And we thought that there was no need to reconsider causality, so no need to reconsider the evaluation. In this way, we recommended annual air quality levels for NO2 having 10, but also recommended interim target. As you see, the interim target for NO2 was the old air quality guidelines in 2005, exactly 40 micrograms per cubic meter. I want to skip part of other, the other parts, but I want to show the same example for PM 2.5. You see the studies. These studies ranked by the fifth percentiles, and again, this was the accusation that there are no studies with below 5 micrograms cubic meter, but you see the study listed here, and this is the evidence that has been the base for the PM 2.5 air quality guidelines as 5. And as you see, for annual value of 5, we decided interim targets. And again, the interim target for is 35, interim target 1. This is the same of the previous guidelines. And we consider as interim target 4 the previous air quality guideline. Let me go to some part that we're not considering and they are relevant for Eastern countries. For some component, for some pollutant, we decided not to make quality guidelines, specifically for black carbon, elemental carbon, ultrafine particles, sound and dust-borne particles. And so we arrived to good practice statement because they were concerned of health effects, but insufficient data to formulate their quality levels. And the recommended actions were monitoring, research on health effects, and of course, mitigation of exposure. And this is a slide from WHO, and specifically on sun and dust storm. I think this is important for Eastern countries. And the indication was to maintain air quality management and forecasting of dust advections, maintain air quality monitoring programs. More important, conduct epidemiological studies to understand the toxicity of desert dust, and implement wind erosion control and planning expansion of green spaces. You know, you can, and I think Mazen can comment on this aspect. You can find those in the guidelines. There was a lot of discussion about these guidelines, but this picture here, I think, is very important. This is these are the exposure response function from the new LAP study. The LAP study 1 paper has been published in BMJ, and I know beginning of January, the results from the 7 countries in Europe, the administrative studies will be published in Lancet Planetary Health. And if you compare, these are the exposure response function from the labs. If you for PM2.5 and NO2, and you see here where the new air quality guideline is positioned in the new exposure response. So I think this is a very good demonstration that the air quality guidelines have been developed to protect public health. As you know, the publication of the air quality guidelines came with the support of 100 scientific societies in the world, and this has been published as a scientific in International Journal of Public Health. And I think this is, you know, WHO indicate that the air quality guidelines can be used as an evidence-informed tool to stimulate research and of course for climate actions. And the single countries can use the air quality guidelines to establish legally binding air quality standards, strengthen the multi-sectoral cooperation, and take effective steps to reduce health inequity. I have to say that at least in Europe, the new air quality guidelines have been taken seriously by the European Commission, and there is the discussion about the revision of the European air quality guidelines, which is a very good sign. And us as epidemiologists and the health sector, I think we have a very important role as an advocacy instrument. You know, this is my presentation, and of course I want to thank Bert Brunnerkreff and Michal Krisanowski for from the guidelines developing group, and I stop here, and sorry I was probably late in my presentation, but I think it was important to provide some input for the discussion.
Thank you, Francisco. This is excellent and a really comprehensive background. We will save questions to the end, but now we want to move to Mazen Alkawi from the Center for Environmental Health Action, based in Amman, which is a WHO affiliate organization that reports on environmental health. Mazen has been a member of our chapter from the beginning, and he is, as you heard, involved with all of these aspects related to the guidelines and air pollution. So he is going to give us some of a perspective related to the region, and then we will open it for questions afterwards. Go ahead, Mazen, if you want to share.
Thanks a lot. Just let me prepare for sharing the presentation. I hope you see my presentation.
Yes, we can see it. Yes. clear.
Let me start by thanking Wael for bringing this very serious issue to the attention of the ISEE chapter, and to Francisco, who summarized the very difficult process of 5 years in less than 20 minutes. And I'm glad that along with me and Francisco also, there are two experts from the region who were part of the process, Marwan Marwan from Kuwait and Sadiq from Iran. We've tried our best, to have expertise from all over the world in order to contribute to the very rigorous and difficult process. I hope the take-home message that you can take out of Francisco's presentation, that the process for preparing the guidelines is heavily based on science and on evidence, and is very seriously considered by the top-notch experts of the world. Let me share with you the status of air pollution and the difficulties that we are having in meeting the WHO guidance, whether the old version or the new version of the guidelines. That's for different reasons. In the Eastern Mediterranean region, 670 million people lives in 22 countries, 19 Arab countries plus Afghanistan, Pakistan, and Iran. Those are very diverse countries in terms of income, in terms of environmental conditions. To give you an idea about the region, for those who are not aware of how much is the impact of environmental risk factors on health, we lose about 1 million annual deaths prematurely because of exposure to different environmental risks. Almost 50% of that toll, about 500 deaths, are attributable to indoor and ambient air pollution exposure annually. This is one of the difficulties that we are facing. These are the urban areas that are reporting PM10 data, monitoring and reporting. If you see the countries of the region, unfortunately, that's Europe, we're really heavily populated and heavily monitored. The PM10 is monitored in all parts of Europe. While if you look at our region, it's scattered. Some of the countries don't have even a single urban area with proper air quality monitoring. But the lack of monitoring of air pollution is still evident in some parts of the region. That's another map for the PM2.5 monitoring. The picture is even worse. Very few countries are monitoring the particulate matter 2.5, which is by all means is a very good indicator about air pollution, particularly when you talk about the health impacts of air pollution. This is a map prepared by WHO recently. It's the annual mean levels of fine particulate matter PM2.5 in cities population weighted. That's to report to the SDGs. You see the darker green means the heavier pollution. So you see all the countries of the region, unfortunately, are higher than the levels recommended by WHO. This map was prepared based on ground-based data collected from the different member states, as well as from satellite data and a chemical model. These are the 22 countries of the region with the level of annual mean concentrations of particulate matter 2.5 in comparison to the recommended level of WHO, the new one, the 5. You see all the countries of the region are exceeding by multi-folds, the safe levels, if we can call the air quality guideline levels recommended by WHO. And it is clear if you look at the countries that the Sahara Desert is contributing to air pollution in a country like Qatar, Bahrain, Kuwait, Saudi Arabia, Pakistan, Iraq, and Afghanistan. And if you look at the health impact of those levels of air pollution, and I'm talking about the ambient air pollution, not the other indoor air pollution, about close to 150,000 people are dying prematurely because of exposure to PM2.5 in the ambient air. And this level is varying from 120 per 100,000 population to about 40 in a country like Bahrain. We know the level of dust in Bahrain is very high. and the level of particulate matter is very high, but still the toll of death and the burden is less than other countries like Yemen, Afghanistan, and Egypt. And the unfortunate part of the story that most of these countries are countries in emergencies where several risk factors are affecting them. That's another recent article published in 2020 about the sources of air pollution studies all over the world. And as if you see, the intensity is very high in the States, in Europe, in parts of China and India, but unfortunately not in our part of the world. Although we know that most of our countries are within the desert belt, but we don't know how much exactly the desert dust is contributing to the levels of PM10 and PM2.5. This analysis concluded some conclusions that in countries like Emirates and Saudi Arabia, where you see the yellow part, which is the contribution of dust, is high. What is urgently needed is to better understand the mixture of air pollutants in our part of the world in order to have proper air quality management plans. And if I can categorize the gaps and challenges that are facing us in air pollution, as well as in meeting the levels recommended by WHO, first is the high prevalence of natural air pollution, mainly talking about sand and dust storms, and noticeably we started seeing them increasing, possibly because of the increasing water scarcity and the impacts of climate change. Controlling the desert dust is not as easy as controlling the anthropogenic sources. Some of these resources are coming from other continents, some is coming from other parts of the world, and regional and even international collaboration is needed. On short term, it's difficult to reduce the impact of dust. You need long-term plans and strong collaboration. What is really is a real gap and challenge in the region are the economical and political reasons. For instance, the poor infrastructure and poor urban planning and land use in most of the urban areas of the region. The high dependence on private transportation instead of public active transport. The types of fuels and technologies that are used in transport, industry, and power generation are still, with very, very high emissions. Why we are choosing those technologies? Again, because of the economical situation in most of the countries of the region. Emergencies is another main cause of air pollution in different parts. First, in countries where emergencies are ongoing, it's very difficult to monitor air pollution and to know what's going on. Several countries that are seeing ongoing emergencies stop monitoring their air pollution. But a unique, for instance, source of air pollution is the diesel generators, which is that are used for production of electricity in a country like in a city like Beirut, in a city like Baghdad, in a city like Damascus, where really we don't know exactly, but in recent models in Beirut, we're saying that about 12 to 15% of the PM2.5 in the city is coming from diesel generators. But this is why, on top of the other sources that are well known in other parts of the world, we have our own sources of air pollution. And again, when resources are not enough, the competing priorities start to take. Where is the control of air pollution on the agenda of the decision makers and political leaders? I think we have in the health sector, we have a very important role to play by conveying messages to decision makers that it should be a competing priority. A serious handicap actually is lack of information in different forms. First, poor research. We do not understand the linkages between air pollution and health in local environments. As you see, most of the studies shared by Francisco and used in developing the guidelines and used usually in developing the health impact assessments are coming from the West or from the United States of America, where relatively the levels of air pollution are less, and the mixture of pollutants is completely different from what we see in our part of the world. We need to do our own research. We need to do our own cohort studies in dusty environments in order to better understand the contribution and the toxicity of the mixture of pollutants in our part of the world. The poor monitoring and reporting of sources of air pollution is another handicap. In some of the countries, we really don't know what's happening, and in some others, researchers started tapping inventories and measuring the different sources of air pollution. And also, this is usually not seen, is the lack of reliable health and population data, which is very important when trying to understand the impacts of air pollution on the health of the public. The way forward, actually, we developed a regional plan of action for the years 2017 and 2021. We are now putting the final touches on that to help the countries of the region on addressing all these gaps. But what we recommend actually is, from the health sector point of view, is we need to communicate, first estimate, and then communicate the health impacts of air pollution to other sectors for developing coherent multi-sectoral policies and actions across all other sectors like transport, industry, energy, agriculture, urban planning, for preventing air pollution, because this is the only management is to reduce the pollution right from its sources, and to help the policymaker in putting it on the top of the agenda. It's good to estimate the health and possibly the economical impacts of such levels of air pollution. Again, we are supporting countries to strengthen air pollution monitoring and health surveillance, and supporting research on air pollution and health at local levels for addressing the natural sources of air pollution. Back to you, Wael.
Thank you, Mazen. So now we can start looking at the questions. What we're going to do is going to look at the chat questions and ask Francisco or Mazen to answer them. And then if we have time, we will open it for actual voice questions or direct questions. That way we can, give everybody an opportunity. So the first question comes from Amina Halmi. She says, human response to air pollutants is the same for all countries, or we had to do research? It's not clear what that means, but anybody wants to try and answer that?
I can try if you want. Yeah, of course. My experience in my life has been always to be a public health officer and at the same time a researcher. As a public health officer, I would say we have enough evidence to act. As a researcher, I would say, of course, we need more research. The situation is that not only it's true that the humans are the same everywhere, but we know for other experience that the response to a specific toxic may be different in different parts of the world. And this is due to humans, but it's also due to the possibility of a specific toxicity of the exposure. So, and these are very open questions. So for this reason, I think we need a lot of very good research from different parts of the world. We have enough evidence to act, as WHO is saying, but we need to conduct research in countries where we have scanty data, very few data, and the possibility of differential response is likely.
Okay, thank you. I have another question. Yes. From Sadiq Hassan, saying, given the high levels of PM in the countries of the region due to natural resources and economic reasons, and also the great distance to the updated guidelines, that means, it's much higher. What approach do you suggest for them to reach the guidelines interim target levels? And some of that was addressed by Mazen, but practically, what are the first steps that can be done? If maybe Francisco can start with his ideas, and then Mazen can.
Unfortunately, I have no experience in Eastern countries, but I've acquired a recent experience with Nigeria with the city of Lagos. And the situation there is that there are a lot of different sources, anthropogenic sources of particles. The annual levels of particles, of PM2.5, is about, the population weighted exposure is about 49. And you have there a lot of different sources from traffic, of course, the electricity generators, waste burning, and the port. And also there is a desert dust component. The desert dust component from the politicians is amplified. But we know that it is only a component of the PM2.5 during specific part of the year. So our message is to reduce, in any case, the anthropogenic sources and to work to reduce those sources. Because the Saharan dust may be sometimes a sort of justification for inaction. That's something that I have seen in several parts, including Italy, I have to say.
Thank you. Mazen, is there anything else you want to add?
No, I fully agree with Francisco. I think the start is to know how much is really the anthropogenic sources, because sometimes we are amplifying the contribution of the desert dust. We are blaming the desert dust of something that might not be responsible. And then we go for the anthropogenic sources and start with the very low-hanging fruits. I don't want to name countries, but some of the countries, they know the problem and they know the solutions. Like, for instance, they use heavy oil in producing electricity. We know that this is a main source of air pollution, and going for cleaner fuel is going to improve the air quality immediately. And this is what in the countries they do in cases of heavy pollution. The question is why we are using heavy oil? Because it's cheaper than gasoline, than other cleaner sources of energy. But the estimate is not done in a fair way. You don't estimate the health impacts embedded by using the heavy oil. You just compare the savings of using this particular fuel or that particular fuel. I would say that proper health impact assessment of interventions is a good way for advocating for action at national level. The interim targets offered by the WHO guidance is a very good stepped approach rather than addressing the 5, for instance, take the PM2.5, you start with the 35. You know that, for instance, the transportation sector is contributing this amount of PM2.5, and then you go for gradual solutions, shifting to public transport, using cleaner technologies, using cleaner fuels, and usually these are stopped by resources. The studies, the feasibility studies that are being done are usually not inclusive of the health component. But I would say that as an advocacy tool, if you include the human cost, if you include the well-being of the public, that would give a better way of judging decisions. Back to you, Rawal.
Thank you. Jaz, you had a question in the chat. Maybe you can try and summarize it very briefly. I couldn't understand it.
Thank you very much. My question was this, that I couldn't understand whether whether the process of looking at the different studies, perhaps those were all cohort studies or case studies. Did they do a systematic review or a series of systematic reviews and applying the grade criteria to find out the quality of the studies, or they combined the systematic reviews and did an overview of systematic reviews where they used the grade criteria for looking at the evidence, and then the process for the guidelines was started. I just wanted to know if it could be explained. Thank you.
Francisco, do you want to answer that?
Yeah, sure. I'm sorry I was not clear regarding that. First of all, the systematic reviews were conducted. Systematic review according to a specific protocol that was published on Prospero, and the systematic review were done, together with the application of the grade approach. So after the collection of all the results and after the forest plot, the grade approach was applied to evaluate the confidence in the results, and including the risk of bias, for instance. So the grade was applied there, and then when the air quality guideline was drafted, we went back to the grade and we said, we asked ourselves, is this the evidence that support the air quality guidelines? Is this evidence high according to grade? So basically we use grade twice, in the systematic review and in the evaluation of the overall evidence supporting the air quality guideline.
Thank you. Farzana had a question in the chat and also raised the hand. So maybe go ahead, Farzana, you can ask.
Thank you so much, and thank you, Francis and Mazan, for a wonderful presentation. I have one question to Francis about the air quality guidelines regarding the particulate matter 2.5 and NO2, keeping in view the present anthropogenic sources of the emission of conventional pollutants, and especially the slide presented by you about the 5% sample and their correlation. While in East Mediterranean country, especially where we are facing this challenge of the particulate matter 2.5 very severe in the winter, and entire world is aware about the happening of the smoke in Pakistan, India, especially in the month of the November, December, and the January, and our economic activities are being challenged by this. What do you think about the real or actual database analysis about the development of the new air quality guidelines regarding this pollutant 2.5 PM? And then you shared the case of the NO2 related to some other countries where this research has been conducted. And my concern is about the real data research in East Mediterranean country, and especially in the country like Pakistan, India, Sri Lanka, Nepal, or neighboring countries. What is the actual mortality rate we can identify over here, Mizan? And because back in 2016, I had the experience of a meeting in Jordan about this air pollution and the related mortality rate. And over there, this data was presented, and it was not based on the actual data, or I will say on the primary data with ground truthing to determine the mortality rate because of these air pollutants. but it was just an estimate. So my fear about this air quality guideline is that so far in Pakistan or other countries, in the neighboring countries of this region, while we are talking about the particulate matter 2.5 is the standard of the 35 microgram per cubic meter, will we be able to achieve new air quality guidelines, or we will be able to establish new standards for these pollutants? Although SOx and NOx are less challenging, but still it is challenging. So my question to both of you, looking into the actual scenario of these countries and what research-based data can be developed in these countries, and we need to have the real on-ground truthing and its relation with the mortality actually happening, because based on the data of the Canada or any other developed country, it will be the environmental injustice with the developing countries or with the countries who are already vulnerable for the climate change or for the air pollution, to put this statistics and fit into their scenario. Thank you so much.
Thank you. And please, when you ask questions for everyone, try and make it brief so we can use the time as much as possible. Dr. Francisco or do you want to answer the question first?
It was very difficult for me to catch all the points.
Let me start, Francisco, because I was in Lahore and I know part of the story.
So, please, Mazen, go ahead.
First of all, in order to have appropriate air quality management, you need to know the sources of air pollution. You need to have a quality monitoring system in place, and to know the sources of air pollution. In the case of Lahore, they face the black smoke in parts of the year because of burning rice waste, in the neighboring country of India and in Pakistan itself. And this is not unique to Lahore. Cairo used to face the same problem, and we can make use of the lesson that was made in Cairo. Cairo used to have a black smoke in October and November, and every sector was blaming the other that you are the source of air pollution. Somebody was saying it's the transport, somebody was saying it's the Ministry of Agriculture, and finally they found that all the farmers who are planting rice burn the leftovers because they want to hide their income and their production, because it seems that ultimately you cannot produce more rice than a certain limit. And then the government of Egypt addressed it by educating the farmers to make use of the waste by changing this law of...
Mazen, sorry to interrupt you. My question is not about the sources of the pollution. We are well aware about the situation in Pakistan or the Twin Punjab or this region especially. My question is about the relation of these air pollution with the mortality rate which you have mentioned in your presentation. Thank you.
Yeah, then if you know how to control the smoke coming from India and from the rice fields, then part of the story is related. Now, if it comes to estimating the health impacts of air pollution in a specific population or a country, you need three sources of data. First, you need to at least to have the level of the annual mean of PM 2.5. You need to know for instance, if we are talking about death, we need to know the natural mortality rate in that particular geographical area, and you need to know the population. If you have those three figures, and you are sure that those three figures are accurate, then your study will be very reliable. What we've faced in different countries, because we did so far 7 training courses on impact assessment of air pollution, that we have a reason to believe that uncertainty in all the sources of data. The data coming from the air pollution stations is not accurate, is not covering the whole geographical area. The population data is not Possibly it is accurate at the national level, but not accurate at geographical level. And the health outcome data, take it, for example, the mortality, the natural mortality or the non-accidental mortality was not disaggregated by cities or by population exposure. So if you have those figures are correct, the methodologies are well known, they are being used in every part of the world, and your results will be accurate, of course, with a certain level of uncertainty. What I know about, for instance, the situation in Pakistan, I don't know if you started your air quality monitoring in different parts of Pakistan, because it was working in some cities, but not working in other cities. We've tried to help by taking the ground-based data coming from the reported by the government of Pakistan, and then put it in the WHO model and trying to estimate the levels of PM2.5. But it's never too late. Having said all this, the door is still open. WHO is now trying to do a new estimate of health impact of air pollution. And please, if you have new data on the PM2.5 in the different cities of Pakistan, we will be very much delighted to include it in the new study.
Thank you. Now, let's go to, I have a question from Faizan, and then a question by Ali, and then a brief comment by Marwan. So let's go in this order. The question from Faizan says, is it appropriate to guidelines? Is it appropriate to use regression models for calculating significance? I think this is probably for you, Francisco.
Yeah, I have to say I don't understand these questions. The statistical methods were different in the different single studies. Most of the core studies were applying the Cox proportional hazard model. And of course, the effect estimates were coming from this specific way of doing the analysis. And then the systematic review had the random effect model, and of course, the pooled effect estimates comes with confidence intervals and of course, statistical significance. So all the statistical procedures were very much evaluated in the process. And the core studies were based on regression models. And of course, this comes with prediction of confidence intervals and statistical significance.
Great, thank you. Ali, go ahead, ask your question.
Yes, thank you. You can hear me?
Yes.
Yes, actually we have done lots of studies in Kuwait and in Iraq, and the concentration of PM2.5 is heavily loaded with suspended dust. We call it dust haze or suspended dust. For example, 40% of PM2.5. And this has been evidenced in multiple countries, in multiple cities in Iraq, maybe 10 cities, as well as also Kuwait. And we did not only use, for example, ground monitoring stations of the country. We used, for example, Harvard samplers in two cities in Kuwait, as well as we used very advanced techniques like machine learning and remote sensing. And luckily also, we have confirmed this during COVID-19 lockdown for 50 days in Kuwait. And the PM2.5 concentration was 20 microgram per cubic meter. So with complete lockdown, no anthropogenic sources, it was 20 microgram per cubic meter. So that's why my concern is the PM2.5 levels, which has been set by air quality guidelines. I would not say it's difficult to fulfill in the Arabian Peninsula, but it is impossible to fulfill. Thank you. If you can comment on that, please.
Maybe you start with Mazen, because this is something you addressed.
Yeah, This is one of the major challenges actually that we are facing, and I would say two answers to this question. First is, as I said, make sure that you are controlling the anthropogenic sources. Even if you accept the level of 20, for instance, which is the background, or 25, then you are expecting a reasonable health impact because of that natural dust, which I'm sure the Ministry of Environment and the other sectors would have very long-term plans of controlling such figures. The other thing is try to understand the link, the relation between health and between air pollution and health in the specific areas where, for instance, the 40 levels of air pollution is coming from dust. Can we use the same exposure response function that we used in Italy, for instance, where the highest level of air pollution is 30 and the contribution of dust is less than 2%, for instance? We don't expect big changes, because what we've seen in studies like China, for instance, where the highest level of air pollution was 80 in comparison to 30 in European cities, that unfortunately the exposure response function followed the same trend. Is it going to continue the same trend in dusty environments where the levels are very high? Nobody will be able to answer this question from America or the West. It has to be us in the Eastern Mediterranean region and the neighboring countries, where really we do either the expensive cohort study in dusty environments, or do time series analysis for long-term exposure to pollutants. I hope, Ali, I answered part of your question.
Yes, thank you very much. Very clear.
Unless you have anything else, Francisco, we can move to Marwan.
No, go ahead.
Okay, Marwan, go ahead.
Thank you very much. Good evening, everyone. Good evening, Mazen. Good evening, Francesco. I'm not going to talk about our contribution for the development of the WHO guideline and difficulties that we have faced. And as you remember, Francesco and Mazen, I was the one who raised the issue of desert dust during the meeting with the WHO development group, guideline development group. But in the end, we came up, due to the epidemiological studies and the systematic review, we came to a value which is very low, depending on the lowest level of exposure, which is scientifically based and verified. I'm not arguing about it, but I want to talk from monitoring and regulatory body in Kuwait. It is quite difficult, and as Dr. Ali said, we have a problem not only with dust storms, we have problems with the occurring dust storms about 10 times per year. And then you have the rising dust, you have the dusty days, you have the resuspension of dust. So every day, even during the closure of all activities, still have PM 2.5 contribution from dust, which is resuspension of desert dust or dusty days. Monitoring is a problem. We are monitoring PM 2.5, and everyone is relying on our monitoring and on the, as Dr. Ali knows, on the some station by the US Embassy in Kuwait, and always PM 2.5 indicating high values. We will never be able to achieve the 20, not even the 10, or the most stringent 5, not in a million year. So from monitoring point of view, we are the new guideline value 5 micrograms per cubic meter. We are working close to the detection limit of the most used instrument for like PETA attenuation instrument. In addition, you have the problem of the as the authority in Kuwait. Kuwait Environmental Public Authority are always blamed in the media by the NGOs, by international organizations, that you are doing nothing. because always the PM 2.5 is high and a huge contribution is coming from natural sources. I know, I agree with Mazen, as he said, that we are always trying to exaggerate the contribution of desert dust. Yes, this is true. It's true, but we can't really deny that it is not our problem. It's a problem of the region, the nature of the region. You have desert coming from the Saharan desert. You have desert coming from Saudi Arabia, from Syria, from Iraq, from everywhere, the Gulf countries. So in the end, in terms of management and regulatory body, it's quite difficult to apply this stringent guideline value. Even with the 10 microgram as annual mean, our annual mean always around 50 to 70 microgram per cubic meter. So even with the old guideline, we will not be able to comply. And everybody is blaming us that you have carcinogenic compounds of PM2.5, that it is carcinogenic material classified by WHO, and people are exposed to carcinogens every day. They say it every time the indicator of PM2.5 in Kuwait goes above the red line, like above the WHO guideline old value, which is 25 microgram per meter for the daily average. Now, of course, you are using the backcast methodology, so they take the last 3 hours or the last hour. So in that case, monitoring and evaluation and assessment on daily basis of the exposure of the population, it always will be high, medium, or high, or even hazardous during dusty days. So in conclusion, we are having a problem, not only with the new guideline value, but also with the old guideline value in terms of monitoring and management of air quality in our region. So I don't know how to solve it. You said, Mazen, very good point. You have to work on, at least start working on our anthropogenic sources from combustion, from transport, from industry, to control measures and to burn fuel, which is cleaner fuel. For example, in Kuwait, now we are going to have natural gas. We have now installations of natural gas being installed in south of Kuwait, huge amounts. We have 9 storage, 90 meters each for natural gas. This will be distributed to the power station and desalination power plants. So we'll be having a huge reduction in sulfur dioxide, nitrogen oxide, and the amplified and black smoke. But in the end,
yes,
the contribution of resuspended dust, rising dust, and desert storm will remain for millions of years, unless climate change will return back the Middle East into forest.
yes.
I'm sorry to say, Francisco, you remember?
I think we have to kind of allow.
Yeah. Just one last point, please. Why? Francisco, remember that the 5 studies which were used by the WHO Guideline Development Group were based on 3 in Canada, okay? And I think 1 in Europe, wasn't it? So no studies from our region giving this lowest exposure level. So you are comparing the exposure to very clean regions. In our case, as Mazen said, we have to have our own studies to prove that the exposure of 20 microgram per cubic meter, at least the contribution from desert dust, which is not true. I mean, sometimes 70% contribution, 60% contribution from desert dust. So we have to work on our own. Thank you.
Yeah, I think your point is clear, and I think it was more so addressed that this is a problem with guidelines not being applicable to many countries. Kuwait is an example. I think you know, our speakers probably don't have the solutions for this. They are following whatever the data is there. My question maybe to Francisco specifically, would there be a potential exemption of these guidelines to some countries, or some kind of criteria that wouldn't put somebody like Marwan and others in the hot spots, saying that you are not following the guidelines when it is actually mostly background that they cannot control. Is that in any way even remotely an option?
Yeah, let me clear about this. The air quality guidelines are not binding. They are suggested values to member states. The different countries should act based on their power and build up the specific legislation. So I was mentioning, for instance, that the European Commission is now moving for a new EU directive. Remember that the EU directive in 2008 prescribed 25 micrograms cubic meter for PM 2.5, and now they are moving towards a more strict limits. So the guidelines just give to the member states a level, and also interim targets. The meaning of interim target is start to decrease air pollution and start to reach the first step. So the first step, for instance, for PM 2.5 is 35 micrograms cubic meter. So build up your intervention in a way to reduce progressively air pollution. If you want to have, this is a scientific discussion. Of course, part of the PM 2.5 may be reduced, part cannot be reduced because of the natural sources. This is something that, of course, each member state could decide. But this natural sources should not be the excuse to say, oh, the air quality guidelines are too low, impossible to achieve. We have natural sources. There is nothing that can be done. We need studies here. This is we need study here. Is very true. We need studies in Eastern countries. Definitely, we need specific exposure response function. But if I know that in some specific animals, 2 cigarettes per day cause lung cancer, this means that probably 30 or 40 cigarettes per day in another specific area could cause more lung cancer than what I see in that specific experiment. So we need specific studies in these countries, specific studies, because the level is high, but also the sources are different. So we need more studies in Eastern countries because we want to challenge the paradigm that the toxicity of PM is the same everywhere. I don't think that the toxicity is the same everywhere. So for this reason, we need more studies. But this is not an excuse for not acting.
Yeah, this is a very good point, Francisco, that you made, which I think it's clear, and maybe it needs to be reemphasized, that these low levels are based on the precautionary principle that we want to be the safest as possible and make sure that this is the best target. And then if people cannot achieve it, that's not something that is terrible, but it's a target. Because as you said, like the example, if 2 cigarettes are causing cancer, how can I say, oh, you can, okay, smoke 5 cigarettes when I know that 2 cigarettes causes cancer? So that's kind of the analogy of why this level is. But I do think that there needs to be an explanation for countries or those who are in charge of these countries about these aspects, rather than take it at face value, and which is a question that was asked by Ahmed from Iraq, saying, are these guidelines communicated to the ministries of health, to the people who are decision makers in some way or form or another so they can act on it, or they might not even know about it. So I guess that's something for Mazen, because for the region at least, how far are people aware, those who need to be aware in the Eastern Mediterranean?
Yeah, decision makers and different stakeholders are aware of the new guideline values. And specifically in the region, we are planning a meeting to discuss how to implement, how to adapt the WHO guidelines for developing national standards in view of whatever we were discussing with Marwan and with others. That would be most probably in February next year. At the moment, we are preparing the background information for, the situation analysis of the different countries of the region. Very soon, we will distribute a questionnaire to the 22 countries of the region, trying to understand the different aspects of air quality management and monitoring. And in view that, hopefully, we will be able to at least guide the countries where to go in trying to meet all the challenges. One way of addressing the air quality guidelines, Francisco mentioned something. They are not binding. They are not binding documents. You are not forced to use it and convert it into standards. It's up to you within your local circumstances. What you can use it along with the interim targets is to see the health targets and how much health gain you get moving, for instance, from 35 to 20, to the second interim target. Because moving from interim target, the old one, which is 10 to 5, you gain only 4%. But this is how you communicate it, rather than having it as a red light and you are not allowed to cross it. And usually the media will go into having the sort of, now you are violating the rules, you are exceeding the things. What we are trying to help the Ministries of Health and Ministry of Environment, that while communicating, the levels of air pollution and their impact on health, put it on this way. See how much life you are going to save. What is the target in the coming year? And no excuse. You need to start immediately with the anthropogenic sources, trying to understand what is going to have at levels of higher air pollution and at the level where really the mixture is different. Will help you in better understanding the impact of air pollution, but will never be an excuse for not taking action.
Thank you.
I think I just want to say, Mazen, for your information, for the region,
Marwan,
we have started. Sorry.
Marwan, sorry, we're out of time. I apologize. You can communicate with.
Well, I have very important question. Sorry, I'm interrupting, but it's really important.
Ms. Dr. Zana, we are recording this, and so we have to respect that everybody needs to leave, and we can stop the recording. And then if you want to continue with a discussion or email, we have to respect that. So I'm sorry, I have to use that. So at the end, we thank our two speakers for their time and valuable input for this region. Clearly that there's a need for data, and I think everybody here needs to take part of that. You're all scientists, and you have to take a part in your country and lead. And our chapter, the International Society for Environmental Epidemiology Eastern Mediterranean chapter, is one of the purposes of it is to help develop that. So you are welcome to join our chapter, and we are actively seeking members. And also, I had this discussion with Mazen some time ago when we started that we need an air pollution study going for the region. So you're welcome to join forces. At the end, very, very much thank you for all of the discussions and those who are attending. And thank you and have a good night. I know it's now very late in Pakistan, our furthest country, and it's morning here in California. So have a good night, good afternoon, and good morning for some. And we'll see you hopefully in the chapter. Thank you, Francisco. Thank you, Mazen.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye. Bye-bye. It was great.